Okay, so we just finished up our chapter on intelligence, and now we're going to move into the chapter on personality, more particularly personality development. So, how you get your personality, what is part of your personality, um, how do you get it? Does it stay true over time? So, there's a lot of different kind of pieces and parts that we're going to take a look at as we go through this chapter. So go ahead and grab 14.1 if you have not done so already. And we are going to take a look at the trait approach today. So as we go through these different sections, all of these different theories out there are meant to explain, how your personality develops, what's composed of your personality, as well as how do we assess or test your personality. How do I know that you are, what we call an introvert, that you're really to yourself, or that you're an extrovert, like you're this really outgoing person, or that you're a little bit more conscientious in your stuff. You're more of a perfectionist. So how do we know all that, and where do we get that information from? So that's what we're going to take a look at in this particular chapter. So this section deals with something called the trait approach. But before I start to dive into that trait approach, I really need to define what we mean by personality. So, personality is your patterns of feelings, motives, and behaviors that set you or people apart from one another. What makes you you? How do you respond to, particular situations? How do you feel? What are you motivated by? How do you interact with others? Are you the person that I could say, okay, you're going to go give this speech to a large group of people? Some of you would have absolutely no problem with that. Others of you would be a little bit more, apprehensive. So, it's situational, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So psychologists really seek to describe it. So just like I said, are you that extrovert or introvert? How it develops, is it something that you're born with? Is it something that's stable over time? So, if you're really quiet and reserved and to yourself, are you going to be like that, as an adult? And then, try to predict it too. How are you going to be able to respond to life's demands? If you're an introvert, what type of jobs would be good for you? So, those are some of the things that we're going to take a look at. So, the first theory that we're going to look at is this trait approach. So, what we're really looking at are traits, right, as part of your personality. So, a trait is just an aspect of personality that is considered to be reasonably stable. In other words, it's not going to change. We know that there are definitely certain situations that, can cause people to not behave the way that they normally would. For example, if I'm an extrovert, generally speaking, crowds don't bother me. Speaking in front of people, don't bother me. However, I have my limits. I'm not going to be up singing, karaoke in front of a whole bunch of different people. So, what are some of these traits that are essentially unchanging? And you can see I have some traits, listed, to the left. So there's a few different theorists out there that fall under this trait approach or this trait theory. If we go way back to ancient Greece, we can actually trace some of this back to Hippocrates. Now, Hippocrates believed that your body has 4 different types of fluids, and the traits that you have are the combination of these different fluids. So, and he called these fluids humors. So, if you ever see the term humor, that's essentially what he's talking about. Is it's your trait. So, the 4 fluids that he discussed in your body are yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood. Those were the four fluids that essentially made up your personality. And depending about, how much, yellow bile or blood or phlegm, right, that you have in your system essentially dictates, your personality and, these traits that you might have. If you remember too, if we're looking way back in ancient Greece, they also thought that a lot of the diseases and disorders were because these fluids were not balanced. So if they felt that somebody had some type of disease or disorder, oftentimes they would encourage, vomiting or bloodletting is what they would call, like where you would, basically cut your hand and let blood out to basically restore that balance. So Hippocrates is one theorist that we can take a look at. Another person that we can take a look at is Gordon Allport. Now, Gordon Allport also believed that there are lots of traits that you have. And in fact, he thought that there were 18,000 of them. And these were the building blocks, of your personality. And the combination, right, of these traits create your, personality. He did assume that a lot of the traits that you have were inherited and fixed in your nervous system. So, if you had a particular trait, that was essentially with you for the rest of your life. So there's a couple other different, theorists out there as well. One of the things that you're going to do here within the next day or so is actually take a personality trait inventory. And you're going to take, I believe it's the Myers-Young, not the Myers-Briggs, but you'll kind of see how this plays out here in just a second. So the Myers-Briggs is another personality inventory that we oftentimes see. So that's all that one really talks about. Another theory that's out there is what we call the Big Five. So the Big Five model basically says that you have 5 traits, and these traits are on a range. Okay, so you can remember the term ocean, or canoe. So if you want to re-scramble those letters to make canoe, you can do that too. So these Big Five are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So, for example, openness really means how open you are to experiences, right? So we have this line, okay, this range where you could be really open or, not so open. And these experiences could be a multitude of things, anything from, going to a strange place on vacation to skydiving to even ordering out at a restaurant. So when you go to a brand new restaurant that you've never been to before, are you the person that orders something new on the menu to try it? Or are you that person that orders, the chicken fingers and fries everywhere you go? So there's a range for that. Conscientiousness has to do with, how conscientious you are. Are you a perfectionist? Are you very conscious of your work and what you do? Extroversion is, how outgoing you are. Agreeableness, are you, very cooperative with people, or are you a person that likes to, create conflict? And then neuroticism just means emotional stability. Do you fly off the handle, when something new comes along, or are you, relatively stable? So for this particular model, we know that it is a combination of nature and nurture, but we also know too that, nature seems to play a little bit of a bigger role in this. And that these 5 traits are established very early in your life, and then they remain relatively stable for the rest of your life. So that's the Big Five. So, one of the questions that we oftentimes ask when we're looking at personality is, how do we assess it? How do we measure it? What are some ways that we can come up with this personality, description of you? So, for the trait approach, what we typically look at is personality inventories. And like I said, you're going to take a couple here, over the next couple days. So, a personality inventory is a questionnaire in which people respond to a wide range of behaviors. So, at the lower part of the screen is just a couple different questions that you might see on like a personality inventory, and you're asked to to rate it on a scale of 1 to 5. And the reason that we can do this and we can kind of spit out your personality type is because the tests that are given, these personality inventories, they're measured objectively. We talked about, the difference between something being objective and subjective. If something is objective, there's no human bias there whatsoever. If it's subjective, there's that human bias. I use the example of if I'm teaching a lesson and Mrs. DeLees and Mrs. Bangle are in my classroom, they're going to give me a different evaluation. They're looking for different things. They might notice different things. They might value different things. That's subjective. Objective means there's no human bias. So when we take these personality inventories, a computer can't score them, and oftentimes they do, just because it's much easier to go through. So one example of a personality inventory besides the Myers-Briggs is something called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. You will not be taking one of these because these are about 485 questions or so. You might be able to find them online, but it's going to take you a really long time to go through that. So that's how we assess it. So you're going to take a couple different personality inventories. Those will be loaded in Google Classroom, and those will be due on a different day. So part one is, watching the lecture and, taking notes and asking any questions that you have. And then, another part of this is going to be, actually you're going through and taking, a personality assessment. There's a lot of psychologists that 100% buy into, this trait approach and this trait theory, and it's probably one of the more common ones. And the nice thing about this particular approach is it does explain your personality type. When students take the personality inventories, they're actually really surprised at how accurate it is in describing their personality. But what it doesn't tell you is, where does that come from? Is it really, just nature, or is there a little bit, a little bit more to it? It just tells you what the trait is. A lot of times, too, you'll find, guys, that they'll actually use this to match you with jobs. So, careers will take a look at your, personality assessment, and then, try to match you with careers that way. And you'll take a look at that when you take the assessment. So if you have any questions on the trait approach, go ahead and post them in the class comment section, and I will be glad to answer them.